really glad to be able to introduce our own Andrew Atwood today. I was thinking it was about a year ago, Andrew, that we discussed you changing camps, teams, and I remember, it was a pretty easy sell. We had about $1 million worth of robots, and you were in a room somewhere building your own, about this big. I said, "Are you interested?" You said, "Yeah, maybe." So a year later, having both taught in the undergraduate program in the fall and now, of course, in the MArc2 program, for me, it's been really wonderful to see the work you've done here, how you've embedded yourself within all aspects of the school. Andrew's one of these guys who's I consider extremely precise in many ways, and I was looking at your website recently, and he's the kind of architect who numbers his projects. There's architects who give names to projects, and there's ones who number them, and he numbers them with Roman numerals. And I remember a year ago you had like 3, and now you're up to 7 in different categories, which he categorizes them as objects, machines, work. Work seems to be architecture, which is something else we can discuss, why you would call that. Tools, etc. Machine 2 sometimes will work on project 3, or machine 3 will work on 4. And maybe I have one question for you. You're missing project 4 on your list, so everything's super precise, and it's all, and project 4 is missing. I don't know why. I don't think you'll ever tell us, but if anybody knows what project 4 is with Andrew, please come see me. Obviously, his work is interested in a certain scale and precision, but I don't think he's interested actually in the mechanics of robotics. He, about 4 months ago, sent me an image of some work from the seminar. I think it was some undergraduate work of some amazing spatial drawings made by light. And what I loved about the image was, because it was time-based, you couldn't see the robots. So the robots as object or fetishization of machine were gone, and it was purely about space and a kind of three-dimensional translucent drawing. So what's interesting about him, though, is he's completely adept and at home within that technology. So he simultaneously is making and building his own kind of micro-scale robotics, as well as enmeshed in the software technology that runs them, and is not afraid of any of that to immerse himself in, but is, I think, not what his work's about. I think his work is about a notion of indeterminacy, having to do with a series of experiments that create kinds of accidents, of which he really gets excited about. And that each project somehow seems to me to be about that in one way or another with varying technique. So given that, as usual, this will be Andrew will speak a little bit, and then Todd will comment and engage, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions. So please welcome Andrew Atwood.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction, John. John is, it's funny to think back to that time like a year ago, and a kind of personal thanks to you. You're probably, along with Ming and Hernan, a big reason why I ended up deciding to switch teams over many conversations. But anyway, I am also grateful to be here tonight or today or this afternoon to talk a little bit about some of the stuff I've been doing or was doing that maybe convinced them to give me the opportunity to come and teach at SCI-Arc and be part of this community, but also, well, let's say take advantage of this as a platform to talk about maybe some larger ideas. So I decided maybe a week ago to change or at least modify the title of this lecture to Objects, Machines, and Drawings, and Urban Abstractions, and Doric Columns, and maybe even to simplify it just to Objects, which will be, let's say, the theme that'll try to move through this lecture. So if we're to start somewhere, I think as my students know, I always start with drawing, and to give a little bit of history that probably most of us are familiar with my own kind of slant on it is where I'm going to start to introduce things. So as most of us know, since the 1400s, architecture has defined itself as a problem of design whose primary representational medium or act was the drawing. There are many reasons for this, most notably the ability to first combine the activities of art and math and geometry within a single representational plane, then forcing a resolution of autonomous modes of drawing like the plan and the section and the elevation into a single architectural object. In addition to combining discrete disciplines, the drawing also provided a leveling that allowed architects to compare objects on a single surface, allowing for the rediscovery of classical traditions and the comparison and analysis of them as objects unto themselves. The combination of these things expanded what architects were allowed to do in terms of construction, but also expression, and most importantly, intellection. Over the years, drawing and architecture have been injected with a series of technological advances as well as medium-specific alterations, from the discovery and development of projective geometry and the development of the constructive perspective in the 15th and 16th century to the discovery and development of descriptive geometry in the 19th century, to the eventual evolution of these techniques into techniques of 3D parallel projections such as axonometric drawings in the early 20th century. As people like Andrew Atwood and Michael Young have recently pointed out, one could say that the historical development of technical drawing and architecture are so intertwined as to be viewed as the same thing, one forced into a realm of abstraction and then reconciled around a single material object or comparison of objects. The development of drawing continues to the middle of the 20th century with the development of various diagrammatic techniques, figure grounds, the analytique, types of drawings that extended the agency of the drawing beyond documentation and description into generative techniques of design. However, as we all know, more recently, drawing has been greatly transformed by the rise of the digital, to the point that many would view the digital to produce a rupture, separating technique and medium from historical problems of the discipline and the full potential of the drawing, divorcing process from representation and opening up space for a discourse of affect, sensation, and other emotive forces. Intentionally or not, this has removed the object as the subject of architecture. The subject has become the user. All value was placed on the ability of the thing to produce an emotional response. Everything required a human correlation. When drawing was replaced by the digital model, the ability for a thing produced through and by processes of parallel and autonomous modes of representation allowed and drawing shifted. The digital model was asked to do all the work. The abstraction of orthographic representation and its histories and precedents and the intellectual project of asking, what do you think, was replaced by figures and perspectives and questions like, what does it do and how does it feel? To be clear, this lecture is first about the status of the drawing and its agency in contemporary architecture, and is a project I've been working on for a few years. But as the work has developed, I've realized that the drawing was only the first stage in a much larger triangulation between objects, past, present, and future, and their relationships with each other through their mutual representations. A triangulation that is about the formulation and comparison of objects from one to the next, and therefore relies on historical precedent and representation, and deals more with the relationship between objects as opposed to the correlation between objects and their human subjects. As such, the lecture represents an autobiographical journey through the potential of the object as the center of architecture. One realized through a careful study of the drawing as the primary medium of architecture from which to produce an autonomous object that exists with its own logics, which then reveal its own character, personality, and existence. So, to take a step back, the topic of drawing in architecture is obviously currently a sensitive one. I recently hosted a panel questioning the current status of the drawing in architecture, as obviously did Yale. And as submittals to my panel are indicative of the discipline's current anxiety about drawing, it seems most who care have it drawn into two primary camps. Some have sought a return to craft, a kind of nostalgia for old techniques, while others have taken the opposite approach, which is to cheer the death of the drawing and advocate the novelty of our newer representational mediums. For me, I continue to be interested in something that rests in between these two poles, taking advantage of the space between these two extremes and the new flexibility allowed by drawing's ambiguous definition while playing in the now flexible distance between drawing and building, something whose distance seemed more fixed in historical design processes. For me, this new space is a place to experiment, to ask new questions about the role of drawing and its relationship to contemporary tools. And so, I began a series of projects in which I designed and built a series of machines. In addition, I also designed and built the software that generated the drawings and communicated directly with those machines. And so this first machine extruded a line of plastic and moved on a 3-axis system. Line was important because I felt it provided a direct, literal link to the drawings I was making, which were collections of lines rendered visible by pixels, and the machine's lines would be rendered by the thickness of the material itself. For me, this type of conceptual consistency allowed for me to think of these material manifestations of my 2D drawings as drawings rendered in 3D space. And so obviously when you spend a lot of time developing these things, you end up with something like this on your right. And this is a comparison slide I've shown many times before. The thing on the left is a drawing then produced with a proprietary machine and software, and then the thing on the right is the thing produced with my own similar machine, and probably represents the first turn in this story, which required a sort of realignment of my own original goals in the project. And so new and obvious questions begin to arise, questions related to control and the fidelity between the drawing and the object itself. And so the project became an attempt to control, or precision as John put it, or categorize and to classify, an attempt to make something I was calling a mess into a network or an organization. And so after a series of calibration, I built a series of these things that exploit and take advantage of the dysfunction and corruption and ineptitude of my own machine. So the machine, rather than producing something created and rationalized through a completely different software and tool, which has nothing to do with the process of its creation, instead extends the process through the object and draws exactly what the software draws, revealing the gaps. And then, using the logics of the system, produce a kind of semi-controlled result to test the fidelity of this translatory process. That tension between these two things, the idea about fidelity and control, began to drive a much larger project and a series of other machines. And I should say in all cases, the purpose of these exercises was to mine these processes for the generative potential, or for generative potential. And by that I mean their ability to clear creative space for me to work in and to design in. So this is the second machine, a wire cutter. This explored the line as negative and introduced heat and speed as variables. And objects like these were results of sort of tweaking this machine. And obviously something like this. I should also say I've spoken in the past much more in detail about these machines. And at this point, this lecture isn't really about talking about them all in detail, just about talking about them as the kind of beginnings of some of the more recent work. So they just kind of set up some new things. Some of the machines were far less successful than others. This is a continuation of the line as negative concept and this idea about a kind of tunneling machine. So sort of like this. So the idea being that it would heat up and tunnel into a block of foam. This is its one and only test. It caught on fire six inches into the foam and no longer exists as a kind of functional thing. And so as the projects continued, I began to develop a kind of vocabulary about what I was doing, testing this tension between the mess and the organization. In each case, the point was to introduce physical properties to techniques of drawing, so speed, heat, gravity, grain, etc. This particular machine deposited sand. Here's the software. You can see the potential to print, in this case, landforms. And as always, testing the limits of the machine's ability to translate those lines through a material medium, looking at points and pauses to produce different patterns. I should also say that these things often lead in very odd directions. So in this case, this machine is now the origins of what has turned into a very large and well-funded research project dealing with prototyping landforms as a means to deal with problems at Owens Lake. So with my research partner, Alex Robinson, and I, we've started to use this as the kind of beginnings of something that's growing every day much bigger and has now funded a robot in a whole space. So these sort of weird internal processes sometimes lead to unexpected areas, like lots of money, which is strange to me. Along the lines of the talk maybe Dora gave last week, I also designed a simple robotic arm, which was far less controlled than the ones we have here. And so initial tests of its strength made me realize that the machine was really good at doing only one thing, which was just a step above a mess on the continuum of intelligent systems. So this thing actually piled objects quite well. So this is the software I designed, and so this is the actual line that the machine moves on, which looks sort of like a diagram of dog poop. But when overlaid with the path of the robot, and then ultimately the movement of the robot, begins to reveal a kind of different character of the intricacies and complexities of what it takes to make a pile. And so these are early examples of what this thing actually did. With a little tweaking and strengthening of the parts of the arms, we were able to make a stack. So this is the diagram as it produces a kind of organization, which results in the stacking of different parts. Following the theme of gravity, this is a machine that drops string and kind of makes these, again, the software and drawings, and makes these sort of bizarre inverted catenary structures, which produce a kind of loose structure of string-like material oscillating between bundles, which might read as lines of resolution into totally incoherent, independent strands. And so in each case, these experiments were meant as a way to explore the distance between drawing and construction, each adding or building on top of new variables while testing the limits and tensions between a set of categories related to ideas about fidelity and control, always oscillating between a mess and an organization. But one of the machines began to provide a different reading about its relationship to drawing, and that was the Cnc Wire Cutter, one related to techniques of projective geometry, where the line, or the wire in this case, was not a path of deposition or delineation, but rather a line of construction and projection. And so in these top examples of Desargues' theorem, as it moves into 3D on the right, the spatial possibilities and generative potential of these systems, or this machine, to produce an object in between became of great interest to me, and spurred a series of investigations I did with my students last semester about the generative potential of these drawings and the objects they might produce, this being a catalog of some various techniques by Justin and Paul, who are probably here. And then also the foam cutter's relationship to projection and fabrication techniques like stereotomy. So I went through, again, a kind of exercise in producing a column, something that's continued to be a source of fascination and is what I'll conclude with. So these were some very early studies. But soon after the completion of those first columns, and initially unrelated to that work, I began work on a series of projects that began as urban speculations. The projects were an opportunity for me to explore some of the representational techniques I started through my reading of the foam cutter as a device to construct through processes of projection, in the case of this project, parallel projections or extrusions. The projects were done in collaboration with Anna Niemark and John May, both two LA-based architects. And before we started, we felt like we needed to address a series of questions that represented both graphically how we felt about most things titled urban design, as well as how we would approach the projects more specifically. So in addition to our sort of collective fuck you, we also felt like we needed to make a few things clear. And so these were the questions that we decided we needed to answer. How do you build it? You extrude it. How do you permit it? You don't. How do you draw it and plan in elevation? How do you talk about it as an abstraction? How do you write about it? It is not the natural reserve. It does not solve environmental problems. It is not a self-sufficient ecosystem. It does not create harmony between species. It is not a tourist destination. It is an abstract representation and a monument to its ubiquitous modern image. How do you think about it? As an object. How do you erase it? You reverse it. How do you make it unknown? You misuse it. How is it unprecedented? It's not. And so these are the three projects in order: Bottoms Up, Zoophole, and The Grid. The first project we completed was called Bottoms Up, a proposal for a single urban block to populate the skies of Los Angeles. The project was really meant as a kind of provocation against the skyscraper, as a kind of passé type, and a new type that might emerge that we began to call the sky floater. We felt that this decrease in ambition and aspiration might be compensated by increased buoyancy, allowing for the masses to now crowd the sky. In this case, buildings at the scales of those that populate Wilshire Corridor are twisted into a donut and flipped upside down. So the reference in this case is probably something like Duchamp's fountain, which forced us to ask questions. Now that we did this, now that it's twisted and flipped, what is it and how does it work and what are its effects? But as the project developed, we began to ask a series of other questions. Because as we were doing the drawings of a form that was a result of a project that we felt was probably a little too casual, we began to question our tools a little bit, questioning the means of this thing's production. Because really what happened, we had this form and we had a couple of elevations or mini skylines and we had a plan. We basically had 3 drawings. And if we were to reproduce this thing all over the city and design them, we would have to use those 3 things, we felt. So the questions became less about it, about what it was doing, but how we were doing it, how we were thinking about it. So this is an attempt at our very first abstraction, which is the title to this series of project states, was for us really a kind of shift into how we were working. A step from a series of projects that were solely speculative into something more interpretive and analytical, something that provided a space to misread, something that was about mining the generative potential of an object on its own terms, from the forms of representation that seemed germane to it. So in these studies, the idea of the block is now abstracted into a cube, And how you understand a cube from three sides is through orthographic projection. So the operation of this abstraction became the extrusion. By taking the original three drawings and intersecting them through the middle of the cube, we were able to look at a series of versions of the project. So these four models, using these same three drawings, just related in different ways and producing subtle differences in some places and drastic differences in others. And you will see that this technique of drawing and abstraction adds another component, in some ways reinforcing the distance between representation, the distance representation places between the object and its designer. What I think was important about this very crucial first step into abstraction was that we were developing a set of tools that now allowed us to do two things simultaneously. They allow us to design something and evaluate or analyze or interpret it at the same time, which is something that was quite a bit different in the speculative work we were doing before. So if this was the first project was about 3 axes of extrusion, this project asked the question, how do you extrude from just one side? And the thing that we decided was we needed a really good pattern. So the premise for the project was to question the ways in which humans develop strategies to promote their own love for the environment. And what we realized was that it's not the appreciation of nature in its unadulterated form that is the main characteristic of the human species. Humans express their delight for nature by creating quasi-natures, perversions of natural phenomena. The greatest achievement in the production of quasi-natures is the invention of the animal pattern. The animal pattern is the aesthetic realization of ecological desire that can be applied to anything. One can have a leopard print dress, a zebra print compact disc case, tiger print pillowcases, and anaconda shoes. However, in an effort to remove these aesthetic perversions, we propose to completely remove the animal print from its culture of mimicry, theft, and associations, effect, and aesthetics through abstraction by extruding it and blowing it to a gigantic, unrecognizable scale. So these are a series of animal print cities that we called the Zoopole, a series of 3 cities based on 3 different animal prints and their own ability to relate to convention and suggest strategies for urban development. So this is the leopard city, and like the previous project, these were a series of investigations into the logics of these things as a kind of a priori fact or object. So the leopard print suggests a city with a population of 5 million and is comprised of densely packed 40-story tall buildings. Its plan mimics the tower with cores and curtain walls oscillating between the convention of the tower's cores and the non-uniformity of its exterior contour. The next is the zebra city. Its 300,000 inhabitants live and work and play in a series of 9-story tall slab buildings. Its stripes suggest a building type which centers its vertical circulation to the confluences of its corridors and maximizes its efficiency through the use of double-loaded corridors. Our final city is the Giraffe. Its population is much smaller than the others at 80,000. In this case, the pattern is inverted, creating a city that is a single large building with a connected network of corridors and nodes surrounding large public plazas. The plan suggests the configuration of the mat, a series of large, similar, almost identical corridors which are repeated and open to large plazas and connect large interior spaces of a similar scale. The final project in the series is about the grid of Manhattan. The project originated from the celebration surrounding the 200th anniversary of the Commissioner's Plan and asked us to reconsider the past, present, and future of the city grid based on our reading of its grid. And what we realized was the grid was first and foremost an instrument producing and reproducing the conceptual divisions and material discontinuities that lie at the heart of modernity. However, through years of exceptions and conceptual neglect, we felt Manhattan must now be reread as an a priori fact. The original impulses of wonderment and curiosity that first submitted the island to the Commissioner's grid must be reoriented, not around the mythos of industrial society, but rather around the object itself. Seen this way, the primary abstraction recedes and dissolves, opening a space of representation that can reflect our distance from its assumed experiences, affects, and meanings. And so for me, this represented the final move away from a project solely invested in the drawing and its technologies and into an architecture that is object-oriented, one that produced work that was interested in revealing and producing the perspective of objects and their relationships to each other as opposed to our subjective correlations. There was no question in my mind that we understood the grid's effects. We know what it does. What was more important to me was what do we think about it now? How do we analyze it? How do we interpret it? And how can that serve as a model for design? So this is a drawing of the original Commissioner's Plan. The plan added 12 numbered avenues, 155 crosstown streets, which was later expanded, and established the kind of size of the block of Manhattan at, I think, 260 feet by 600 feet. So we did 3 different studies in the abstraction, and the first is and this is a drawing of the first one. The first problem when we started the competition, and it quickly became the primary one, if not the sole one, was how do we take something that is complicated and real and describe it? How is it drawn? How is it modeled? How is it reduced into something that we could talk and think about? So in the drawings, we returned to a technique of extrusion. And if the extrusion is a process of mechanical reduction, in this case, you have to decide what to keep and what techniques do you employ to keep them. In other words, if the whole thing is a big grid, how do we deal with its exceptions? How do we deal with the diagonals, the open spaces, the misalignments, rotations, and shifts in the grid? If we were to deal with this thing as a sort of existing object, how does it organize itself? So what happens is that in each exception, you're required to keep it creates its own territory, not just neighborhoods or grids, and sometimes multiple exceptions in one area require even more territories. So how do you decide what to keep? In this first one, we decided it was important to keep things that made Manhattan recognizable, given the scale and resolution of the drawings and the limits of the material of the models. In this case, foam, as in everything else I've done. So if you're deciding what to keep, in a way, the part of the project is about preservation. What things make Manhattan recognizable? So things like Central Park, Broadway, Ground Zero. And so as you add more things to the list, you end up with more parcels. In this example, we ended up with 17, each requiring their own cube and its own elevations. So in this slide, we can see the deployment of these results. And just like bottoms up, each territory starts as a cube and is formed by the extrusion of 3 sides. So in this drawing, we see both the cube and then the model we see as a result of those extrusions. So if you want to keep something like Ground Zero, you have to create like a little peninsula for it. You can see up in the right-hand corner. Or if you want Central Park, you have to make sure one of the lines of the extrusion actually aligns itself to it. And this is the model broken up into parcels. So this is the second study. If the first one was about exceptions, this one dealt with the totality of the object and its external expressions, so its skylines. And in this case, the island is treated as a single mass with 2 faces, an east and west skyline and a north and south skyline, both extruded through the island's plan, producing basically a monolithic plaid mass that ignores the exceptions that we saw in the first study, basically extruding the largest buildings which survive both north, east, and west through the island. And then this is the last version, which for us is the weirdest. We wanted to replay the commissioner's plan establishing a set number of evenly divided blocks, but rather than one parcel like the previous or the 1,800 blocks like in the original plan, we wanted something in between. So this is 100 blocks, each about 200 acres, which I think is like 150 football fields. While we initially aligned the new grid to the point of the lowest tip of Manhattan, we then began to move the grid to the center and intentionally misalign it from any recognizable features from the first drawing. So it obliterates Central Park, it obliterates Ground Zero. There is no reading of Broadway anymore. It doesn't rotate to the original grids of downtown, and it doesn't align itself with anything else. It produces itself, and it serves as its own reference. So if the original extraction of the commissioner's grid exists only in plan, the Cartesian logic of X and Y, this is more about the Z. And while the boundaries are defined by a plan grid, the actual new grid is created by extrusion and intersection of the elevations for each parcel. And in each example, the grid is rendered not with a plan, but elevation. So they each have their own kind of skyline. And so in an effort to kind of provide a rereading or maybe a misreading of what this new grid produces, we decided that we would pull them apart. So this is our now new grid of the city of New York. Okay, last project. So I've been working on these. This is very much a work in progress about Doric columns, and I returned to the foam cutter as a kind of project with the columns with a slightly different agenda. And it starts with being exposed or sort of, let's say, reintroduced to Perot and Blondell's orders, and then Perot's tables comparing the measurements taken from the classical orders of different architects. And what interested me about these drawings, and I would argue that they're all drawings, is that they are not concerned with the relationship between the columns and their effects, but rather in the relationships between the things themselves. He made the drawings on the top to register his own orders to a larger universal system, a form of analysis and generation all at the same time based on the relationship between the columns as objects, and then, like the previous project, the grid as an object. And by that I refer to the thing on the upper left. The one on the right are Blondell. But what's more interesting is the grids underneath. The same object, the grid, used as a table this time, and what these reveal is a final interest in the object's relationship to each other. The measurements of different authors' orders in it revealing the fallacy of the classical orders, not through an examination of the object's effects, but their internal relationships to each other. And what is important about is that these comparisons of objects happen in drawing. So the interest in triangulation between object and their precedents is fundamentally about the drawing itself. And it happens again here in his taxonomy of techniques about entasis or diminution or the bulging of columns. Perot doesn't talk about the effects of entasis. He recognizes them as confused and subjective. He is not interested in how we experience these things. He doesn't talk about whether entasis is for perspectival correction, as some have claimed, or as others have claimed, indexing some sort of structural force in their bulge. They simply bulge. And his project was an exposition of all the different things, all ways that this might be created, their own relationships, not our experiences. And the same with the fluting as well. So, and because this is about Doric columns, it's important to note that these studies originate with characteristics that are unique to the Doric order. One of the most important things is obviously the flutes. So in the Doric, they typically have 20 flutes as opposed to 26 in the Ionic and the Corinthian. So on your left is a construction of Doric fluting. On the right is more typical of the Ionic or the Corinthian. And the other thing that's important to note is that in the Doric order, the flutes intersect, creating a kind of single defined edge, which is called aorist. And the Ionic and Corinthian have a flatter filleted edge between flutes. And so I began a series of experiments examining entasis and fluting and the problems related to the combination of both, and the freedom allowed by Perot's now analysis of them. And so the main problem was the intersection of the circles in the Doric fluting and achieving a sharp edge. The first study was actually quite conventional, so these are the construction drawings. This is both an elevation and a plan. Note that the elevation is not frontal but rotated 30 degrees around the x-axis. Also note that these columns, like their predecessors, are built in stacked units, each unit cut on the wire form and the wire cutter, so something like this. So it's fundamentally about a kind of projected object. And here you can see the basic construction. So you can see the flutings and then the circles and the inscribed triangles. So the larger that triangle is, the shallower the fluting is. So this is before entasis. This is then the full construction, and then this is then obviously the result. So you can see in plan the actual curvature of that bulge. And then this is a picture of the final mock-up. One of the things that's important to note about this first one is that, one, the seam along the sort of middle right, and then it's not really perceptible, but the kind of jagged edge on the side. And so the reason for this was because the machine wasn't actually capable of coordinating itself to produce flat edges, and so those errors compounded as they went around and cut the block. So the drawing that produced them had to be fundamentally different. And so the machines actually had to introduce a cusp into their, do I have my pointer? I don't have a pointer, but you can see, whereas before the circles intersect here, they must overlap and produce a cusp, which allows, one, for a sharper edge, but it also allows for the fatter part that's being cut to still produce that edge. So these are basically the construction drawings of that. And then this is probably not perceptible to anybody but me, but a much better result in terms of the errors that it produces, still just a Doric column. And so there's a series of versions of these columns testing different ideas while maintaining certain parameters. This one has variable size flutes, and these are the plan and the section, some of the construction drawings, the kind of final result, an image. This one takes that idea of cusp being required by the aorist and turns it inside out as the column moves up. It also, for me, Ramiro, reminds me strangely of your table, so there's something about this that is like, it's sort of chub. And then the bottom two flutes, and this one basically, not to put you on that image, I mean, you don't have to take any sort of ownership, but I just saw it and I was like, this looks like that, I like that table, so. And then obviously the transitioning of the column from a kind of inner flute to an outer flute at the top in this one, in this sort of family. The experiments continue combining more techniques of projection with some more contemporary references. So this is my stranded column, or an attempt at one. Its construction, its results. Also my multiplicitous column. Again, this is an image from some student work. Justin and Paul did this research. Again, an image which shows how like an overlapping between circles not only produces a cusp on the exterior, but actually the bifurcation as you project a single circle through two intersecting circles actually also produces aorist, allowing for you then to build two columns above it. So this is my dual column. all within sort of the logic of its own, let's say, its own creation. And so the references compound. You have Greg Lynn on one hand, and you have Claude Perrault's double column at the Louvre on the other, connected to a lineage of drawing in this case. Okay, so in conclusion, these things are obviously, or these ideas or some of the things I've tried to talk about today are admittedly raw, in an attempt to serve more as a kind of clearing of space for my own self in a search to find places to work. But I thought I would conclude with this slide as an attempt to pull some things together. A slide that was a very important moment in some of the earlier work that I talked about. And there was no question in my mind that I liked the version on the right more, but at the time I couldn't place it. The one thing I knew was that I was not interested in conversations about how the texture and depth of these mistakes produced somehow created an enhanced human experience. A simpler way to put it is that it was not about the fur creating an emotive or atmospheric effect. It certainly is capable of doing all those things, but as I return to these objects, and if one looks at them closer, they are capable of doing more than that, if I let them. What I think about this object is that it was built to see what a drawing looks like in an object. The pauses and gaps and drops produce a rupture in the process of translation that reveals the connection between the two things, the drawing and the object. You wouldn't see the lines if they didn't fail because of gravity or if the machine didn't pause when it was overloaded with data, leaving a bump. It's about the relationship between things, revealing their own logics and personalities, how they draw themselves. The drawing and model and the means of the production are left intact as a project while removing the necessity of having a subject describe its affect or correlation to the human experience. It's about the drawing in the building, and it's about them as objects. Thanks.
So, that was great.
That's the same thing you said at the door.
I only got so many things to say.
I think that's like your, you say that's great, it's not like that was interesting or.
It is a tick that I have that buys me time while the
you're
kind of
thinking,
wheels
okay.
turn.
It's not that it was great.
No, partly it's because I'm trying to come up with a more polite way to say some of the things that are in my head.
Okay.
Does that make you feel better?
Yeah.
And one of them has to do with the last statement, right? So I needed a tiny bit of time to process the last statement, which in effect implied that these things don't need critics, that they stand alone. I think what you said exactly was they don't require a description of their effects. And so, I kind of think about it, that if these things are as aggressively self-sufficient as you're making them out to be, and there were kind of a number of indications of that kind of position, I thought, through the thing.
It's not that, okay, it's not that.
Well, I would just say, what's my job if they aren't that?
I think your job is much larger, actually. For me, I think that it's, the way I would respond to that is that there's a lot of other ways we can, it's not about solely removing any kind of interpretation from the thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's about removing it from what I view as a very narrow way of talking about these things, which has been consumed with a discourse about affect for far too long. And that conversation ultimately becomes narrow. I think we could probably return to those conversations in 20 years and they would be productive again. And it's not to say that they're not productive now. But for me, as a designer, and the way that I think about my own work, that's not, it's not helping, right? And so it's not that I'm trying to remove you or the people that do the things that you do from the conversation. I'm just saying maybe through just looking at and comparison and comparing things, that there's a whole other. It's not to say that you don't do that, but it just seems to have been lost in some of the conversations, which is like a slightly naive statement, but it seems that's basically what I'm trying to say, that there's probably more conversations that we can be had, and I'm tired of talking about what, sitting around and saying, describing what it feels or what it does constantly.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay.
And I think that I think it's actually quite crucial for any designer to define very rigidly the kind of scope of their work and the.
I feel like I'm gonna.
Huh?
Sorry.
Feel like what? No, I think
Microphones, there's 5 of them, they make me nervous.
if we just put the one in the middle, can we just ditch that one? Would that work?
You can try it.
I plan on letting Todd talk mostly anyway.
I promise to yell. And I'll keep this one in case I need to swing it. No, I think it's very important that the kind of terms of the work are defined very closely. But I mean, once that's done, I find that it's kind of fun to find the blind spots, I guess, in such an approach. Now, I think it's interesting that in kind of trying to bracket out affect, let's say, or to suspend questions of experience and foreground questions of, I guess, intellection. What you're doing is not actually removing experience from the conversation. You're actually, I think, imposing or requesting a certain kind of experience, that the way to engage one of these objects is with close attention, is with a high level of disciplinary expertise, is within a certain disciplinary framework, and it is one that it shouldn't be distracted by the kind of neon and glitz and smoke and mirrors. I mean, I think a little bit to another of your hobbies and the necessity of not falling under the sway of the effects of, say, Las Vegas in order to concentrate on the mechanics of the games being played. And so I appreciate that quite, but at the end of the day, what it really seems to me is going on is that there is a very specific kind of attention that you're soliciting, and that mode of attention has that is an effect, that is an experiential effect. And to kind of look at these drawings, you're asking people to look at them in a certain way, and I think that the drawings are actually crucial to that. What do you think about that idea?
I mean, I don't disagree with any of it, other than I don't know, and the way that we talk about experience in architecture, I think is loaded. Like, if I were to actually accept that term to have a much broader definition, then I could agree with you. Meaning, it's obviously when I sit down and I'm looking at drawings or when I'm studying something, there is a kind of, let's say there's a relationship that I'm constructing between that thing, and that might be labeled an experience. And I don't want to get sort of like pseudo-philosophical. I'm just saying it's that word, I think, that bothers me about what you're saying. But there's no question that the one thing that I like very much about what you said is that a drawing, or let's say other things that are crucial to the discipline of architecture other than just its sort of atmosphere, is as important. So the effects that a drawing might have on someone, just in and of itself as its own autonomous thing, is important to me. And to separate those things out as kind of their own, as having their own sort of intelligence and their own ways or methods of working, I agree with that statement. But I don't think I don't think that's related to, let's say, the conversations that we've been having for the last however many years. I don't think we're talking about the effects of Perot's orders as a kind of thing.
No, but I think we might be talking about the effects of Perot's drawings. But I mean, for me, it seems that I think we could agree that the work is pointed at architects. This is not, this is very specifically aimed at an audience that has a high level of expertise and also has a high tolerance for technical specificity, disciplinary conventions, all of these things. I mean, my mom probably would get bored sort of quick. Although
Maybe most architects could, I don't know.
That may be as well, but I find it fascinating, right? But what I'm trying to get at is that it would be easy
Peter
to
checked
kind
his phone a couple of times. I was watching it.
but it would be easy for me. It would be easy to imagine the columns put in a gallery, where I imagine that they're going to wind up on display at some point somewhere, and it would be easy for me to imagine just the columns by themselves and a whole conversation erupting around them about kind of voluptuous form and about kind of any number of familiar conversations having to do with transformation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until the drawings go on the wall, at which point the maniacal precision with which they're executed starts to eradicate the columns. For me, the columns are the kind of side effect of the project, which really has to do with interrogating the technical transformations required to draw a Greek column with contemporary tools and the formal possibilities that erupt from exactly that exercise. And so for me, it's really, the drawings are the entire project. The columns are proof of concept at best, the actual foam objects. Would you agree with that?
Right now, yeah, I would.
Is that okay if it stays that way?
No.
Why not?
Well, because I think at the end, I guess what I would hope is that each one of them stands both in relationship to each other and also independently, meaning that you can look at the columns and you can look at the drawing simultaneously. You can understand the relationship between the two, but you can also understand one as its kind of own thing. And right now I agree those. One, that the pictures suck, and it's very difficult to understand what's happening in those things. So even to talk about them is weird, but that project is like half cooked. But I would say something like the Manhattan Project, which is very much about drawing and the objects it produced. Those things, they're not, one isn't necessarily biased over the other. They are, you could certainly have a conversation about one or the other, but they exist without hierarchy. They are they're in parallel.
The drawings and the models.
The drawings and the models. And so that project I don't view as done either, and Anna and I are talking, and John are talking about extending that project into some other things, but the sort of final results as it stands now doesn't have the problem that the columns have.
But do you see
and the drawings have the same level of precision, they're just, let's say, more minimal.
Do you see those drawings, do you see the models of Manhattan, or any of the models for that matter? I mean, are they representations of a project we are meant to imagine as a built construction in the world, or are they the project?
They are the project.
They are the project.
Yeah.
So the material effects that we would inevitably encounter when we see those foam models, for instance, like the suppression of the material is part of it, right? No, but I just asked.
I don't deny that it can do. I mean,
I'm not trying to
okay.
bust you on. Oh, you don't understand. Like
I'm
I get that
you're going to bust me. But.
No, it's not that at all. It's really what I'm trying to do is to kind of clarify what's at stake in doing these things, and trying to kind of zero in on where it seems I have to put my attention to kind of figure these things out.
Yeah.
And so the idea that the end in itself is that model makes, well, let me make it a question rather than a statement, because I might be wrong. But so would it be then, are the drawings projecting those models in a way that conventional architectural drawings project a building? You see what I'm getting at, right? Because
No, I understand
that somehow a model,
I
a
understand.
conventional model is a form of representation of a building.
Yeah.
And so to kind of turn the model into the end changes the relationship between the models and the drawings.
Let's say, we're calling it a model because of its scale, but it's the kind of end object produced through a process of analyzation and interpretation of a kind of found, let's say, another found object, in that case the island. I don't call it a model. It probably does it a disservice, just because, again, it has certain connotations in that it's a kind of representation of and leads to a larger scaled version of itself.
Well, I guess that's why you started off calling them objects.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, so model probably is even the wrong way to describe it. Those aren't proposals for let's say, rebuilding Manhattan, but they are proposals about how one might look at and think about and draw it. That's it. That's what they are. I mean, they are material, both the drawing and the foam objects are just sort of manifestations of how one might think about that as a project, which is a competition, by the way, about reading the grid.
And what was the competition brief? I'm not familiar with that competition. I was asking John about it before. Like, what was the program?
I have no idea. It was
That is
I
the
have no
perfect
idea.
answer, actually, right? I mean, it is like,
We weren't, I don't know, honest here, but no, I could just say we were not concerned with well, we were concerned with it to a certain extent, and I think that this kind of middle finger graphic was about how we thought about probably that project and the other competitions that we were doing in terms of their briefs.
well, we're quick on time, and this is like the biggest crowd I've seen at one of these in an incredibly long time, so I would like to open it up a little bit, and Dora's already got her hand up.
But I would defer to the student if she wants to ask a question first.
Okay, who wants to fight Dora for the microphone?
You got it. You really feel like I need a microphone, like I don't fill this place with sound. So I actually think that maybe the idea, I like that you're sort of tilting at the hegemony, if you will, of, you know, the kind of effects, and going a little old school with the claiming of the word object, or reclaiming of the word object, because I myself see the work as actually a form of theory, and that in a way, like Perot, it doesn't matter if it's a drawing or if it's a kind of discussion. Or, you know, in your case, it's these models, drawings, things, objects, instead you're using this as a way to describe these relationships that are existing in these very perceived regular pieces of architecture, especially in the columns, and whether it's evidently extant or if it's latent within it, and that you know, you see your work as kind of drawing that out. And actually, I think that's why it's white, and you could correct me on that, but I think that there's a kind of utter whiteness that goes on in the work that might be due to the fact that it's a little bit of a classical throwback to theory and architectural theory and how we understand what theory is and what it does in the architectural world. So that's kind of my first sort of comment. I don't know if it's a question, but I do have an actual question that is a question with a question mark, which is, given your sort of interest in extrusion and the way in which extrusion creates a sameness across the extrusion typically, why have you been interested in splorches, for example, or something that doesn't have that sameness? And two, how do you reconcile the sameness of the extrusion with the projection into the picture plane, and when that happens as a cone?
Okay, so like first the response. I don't view myself as a theorist. I get, and this isn't to say that every architect's work isn't about ideas at some level, but for me it's about, let's say, exposing certain things that I'm thinking about through the work. I write a little bit, not so well. I draw, I'm much better at it. And so, yeah, I don't want to sort of stake a claim to doing theory, but I certainly am trying to expose in the work like my ideas about architecture, so anyway, that's my response. I sort of stumbled through that response. The fascination with extrusion is well, one, there's a sort of taboo, or there was a taboo related to it, and so I think it challenged certain people's ideas about like what it could produce, just as a kind of gut reaction to some of the things, like, let's say, the formal excesses that I was getting tired of. But the other thing about it is that it was tied, it became tied directly to a technology that we were using and had a direct link between, let's say, a representational strategy or technique, an orthographic projection, and then a mode of fabrication with the wire cutter. And so in looking for ways to make connections between those two things to produce things that were conceptually consistent through different mediums was important to us, and the extrusion was a very, very simple way for John and Anna and I to actually do that stuff. Now, actually, that technology in the machine was able to produce or simulate perspectival techniques or techniques of linear projection to a point connected to things like stereotomy in the columns. And so that stuff does get versioned or extended in some of the other work, and then related again to conventions of drawing. So looking at like Desargues' theorem, and then relating that and the sort of three-dimension that, and turning that into a three-dimensional diagram, a la Scott Cohen, but then speculating about the sort of space or the object that is produced in between that is an obvious translation, again, from a kind of technique of drawing based on perspective, or techniques related to perspective, and in the fabrication of the columns in that case. So the column is not an extrusion. Each one of those pieces requires basically essentially a perspective, or a kind of linear projection to a point to produce each segment. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the sort of lineage of that work.
You know, it's funny because like before hearing that answer, I would have said something along the lines of that the move from the various operations that you were looking at with the machines, right? Whether it's piling or drilling or boring out or dropping springs, you know, that there was very clearly identifiable operations, and extrusion is also one of those operations. And it seemed that enthesis, to me anyway, was a way to introduce a kind of degree of difficulty to the problem of extrusion in a very straightforward way. But then to hear you describe it, it actually takes this weird swerve through a place that I never thought, that I would never expect it to go, right? That, you know, through perspective, and you actually quite literally have to run the drawing through a single point in order to kind of
yeah, well, I mean,
generate it.
Yeah, not to get too technical, but the way that the wire cutter works is you have an object in the center. There's a thing that you want to cut out of that object. The machine and the connection between the wire exists outside of that thing. Okay, and so the actual lines or the curves that the machine moves on is totally different than the thing that it's cutting out. Okay, and in the case of the column, every single one of those lines that produces the machine, they coincide at a single point, just because of the bilateral symmetry or the sort of multilateral symmetry of the column itself. So they are literally a point of view, and then a series of planes through which that point is then intersected and registered. So they literally they produce a perspective.
Right.
I mean, that wasn't planned. Really it was about introducing enthesis as a way to kind of challenge the technology, but they are perspectives,
Now,
by definition.
I can predict where this answer is going to go, but you know, given the kind of facility that you're developing with producing all the variations on the theme of the Doric column that you're kind of working through at the moment, and knowing that a lot of historical interpretations of the Doric column had to do with transforming their formal attributes in order to imbue them with personality or gender. Do you see a way that some of these more kind of, I don't want to say experiential, so let me say narrative effects, or kind of metaphorical, it seems to me that poised to open itself back up to exactly those kinds of circumstances that you had bracketed out at the beginning of the investigation.
Yep. No, it is the problem, because this is the sort of hole in using Perot, is that, so I use that to introduce an exercise in the columns, but he uses it as a way to introduce aesthetics or character or personality into architecture that didn't exist, let's say didn't exist prior to that or at that moment. Mm-hmm. And so using that as a kind of, let's say, as a flaw. And it's something that I oscillate between, because on one hand to say, or to sort of subordinate the level of human experience to the sort of level of the object and its relationship to itself and to all these other objects, okay? That to me is quite a bit different than elevating the object in a sort of anthropomorphic move towards things like personality and stuff like that. And that to me, those things are conceptually at odds. And and even in this talk, I use those terms, and it's let's say it's the thing I'm trying to reconcile in my own work at the moment. Not that anyone else would find that interesting, but I do recognize that there's two different things. One is a move up, and one is a move down, and they aren't reconciled. They just aren't. So I can't answer that question.
Tom?
Hey, Andrew, that was really great and clear, a great lecture. I was thinking a minute ago about the lectures that we had 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago between Tom Main and Peter Eisenman, and how it was set up as how extremely different they were, and how one of them set up the problem of extreme autonomy of architecture, and the other one set up the project of almost complete lack of autonomy and influence from external forces. And then I was thinking about your relationship to Peter, which I'm sure that you think about. And I was curious about, well, if you do think about that, and what you think the difference is between Peter Eisenman's use of the diagram to create this autonomy and your sort of substitution of the machine for the diagram might mean, or
yeah, no, yes, I think I thought about that. I mean, that is something I've thought quite a bit about, and isn't something that I think is super fleshed out. But let's just say that there's a kind of interest in precedent and methods and modes of interpretation that allow for misreading in the work that Eisenman does through drawing. That I am, let's say, trying to deal with in the same way, but introducing technology as a kind of thing to be misused or misread. And that doesn't mean like the sort of like the stuff that I do with my students in the robot lab, where there's a kind of intentional sort of flexing of the system to produce mistakes. But I think that there's space in that work as new technologies and new things get introduced in architecture, and as they can confront convention, to provide for the sort of swerves that misreading allows for in the work of Eisenman. So that's something that I've thought a lot about and haven't written down at all. But for me, there is a very clear connection between the two, and it's not something that I could probably like expand on at the moment, but it's something that I've talked to a number of students about in terms of the connection between that work and the work that I do with, let's say, new technologies in architecture.
Marcelo?
Yeah, awesome. I really enjoyed the lecture. I think it's super clear, and I have lots of questions, but just a simple question had to do with the end of your lecture, which I think it probably provoked quite a bit of an interest spark in terms of, let's say, your lack of interest of discussing affect, sensation, and all that. And I think it's a good point. My question is this, and this is a question I usually have with like the sort of all approaches that imply sort of a kind of heavy process base, which I tend to agree is like, are you not interested in expression? And I don't think you're not. I mean, I know, I understand that you're not interested in talking about expression through experiential, subjective means, but just to put it in a blunt way, let's say if the things that you produce at some moment sort of look hairy, and you're not interested in the hairiness for, you know, hair's sake or whatever, for styling purposes, but they're still hairy, whether you're interested or not in terms of that experience is out there, you know, and it becomes as much part of the object as all the intrinsic mechanisms you're producing with it. So I'm just saying, like, how do you like reconcile those?
It's not that I'm not interested in those things. Meaning, I think all work does that and can be addressed on those terms. And I think there's plenty of great conversations to be had about that stuff. And I'm actually happy to have those conversations with other people. Like for me, this is a very selfish pursuit to find areas of work that I'm interested in and that clear sort of room for me to operate in.
Look, I mean, I think, you know, the work is remarkable in its economic sort of display of certain mastery. So I enjoy that. The subject of the output, I think, is very interesting to me in the sense that I think you're willing to be unreasonable about your unreasonableness, and you're willing to sort of take on the possibility that, you know, you're going to leave the discipline to us to figure out. That's good. So I don't disagree with Marcelo, but I think that also maybe what's interesting is that you're saying that the kind of ownership of the affect is the topic of the critic, and that the ownership of the discipline is the work of the architect, and that we shouldn't sort of prime the pump, so to speak, in terms of how things should be registered or interpreted. So that's good. But that said, I want to understand one question. What's the horizontal connection between the object, the field at the urban scale, and then sort of like the detail? Is that the tool that makes all those connections? And if it does, how are you working differently at different scales?
You mean, here?
I mean, in other words, the way you draw through machines is applied different ways to small things, medium-sized things, and then clearly larger fields, which are abstractions, cities, for instance. Yeah. Does the tool change how you think through those different scales?
To my mind, no, not right now. It is not changing. I had to think about it, but right now, in my immediate answer to that, the honest answer is no.
So then the connective tissue then is a certain degree of abstraction that's
Yeah.
required of any question before it can be raised, in your studio at least.
The reason I ask
Well,
is that
yeah.
when I think
That's
about the
definitely-
role of geometry in something like L'Enfant's plan for Washington, right? It's a sort of different use of geometry than, let's say, in the Jeffersonian work of geometry at Monticello. So I mean, it's the same way of drawing in a way, but actually the ideology behind how you draw is very different. One is actually symbolic and representational at the scale of the city. There are 15 points in the city that represent the 15 states at that point in the Union. And in the Jeffersonian kind of, the work of geometry is much more literal, let's say, in terms of how it organizes bodies. Do you understand that?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're running a little bit over, so we have one more question from Mohammed. I'm happy to have this go all day, and I'm sure it's more useful than studio, so.
Can you hear
Mohammed.
me?
I can hear
Can
you.
you hear me? First of all, I want to say also that was great, super lucid, super clear. I have to say that I find the work seriously funny. There's an incredible humor.
I keep
at
waiting
work.
for you to go over the table.
No, I mean this in the best possible way. I think that there is a humor, sort of an absurdist humor at work here, a la Stephen Wright. I mean, the Duchamp thing. I think that for those who haven't visited the columns in situ, you must, because if they don't make you giggle for deep reasons, then there's something wrong with you at so many levels, be it material, be it scale, be it statics, all of that stuff. And I was actually on my iPhone a few times during the talk, Andrew. And we were no. And just thinking, I'd like to maybe just pose a question to you in terms of the politics of what's of what you're doing, and specifically, I think as, let's say, maybe a second generation or a slight tangent. I mean, we're all in the same era, I guess. There's a sort of a geek thing at play. There's a hacker thing at play. You're confounding means and ends. You're appropriating techniques, producing blunt affect, producing what Aureli, borrowing from Agamben, would argue is an absolute architecture, yet without a kind of a shrill, doctrinaire, ideological method. It's deadpan. It just is, but it's also agonistic in terms of the politics of the extrusion, let's say, at the scale of the city. So architecture, the city, ideology, where do you guys stand?
I mean, well, I'll react to the first part. There is a kind of intentional deadpanness to the whole thing, a kind of flatness to the way that it's presented, and an attempt on my part to present it without humor, even though I find a lot of the work full of it, full of humor and full of it.
That was great.
Okay, so and to be honest with you, that's where I'm at. I mean, there's provocation. For me, I actually think that there's and all of that stuff is a kind of intentional provocation to the things that I see around me, and trying to take control or ownership over certain things through literally those techniques. But I also feel like the deadpan thing isn't, or the way that it's presented, I try to at least attempt to present it with a bit of seriousness and precision in the words and honesty about the way that I describe it, because I want it to be taken seriously as a kind of project.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing about...
But it is certainly about, let's say, owning certain things related, not about scale necessarily, but about ideas that cross different scales within
Sure.
the discipline.
And in the disciplinary sense, I do think that we were taken sort of, backstage in the comedic theater. I mean, I think you've let us in on some of the setup,
Yeah.
which is...
Okay, well, Andrew clearly wants us to end. We all have to go to studio. I just want to close by saying this last month at SCI-Arc has been one of the most exciting things for me to participate in an incredibly long time. We opened it with 3 lectures from an older generation, and I think that one of the things that tied those 3 very those 3 very important statements together was, as a kind of older generation trying to come to terms with, in a way, what they had done. And the last 3 lectures in particular, yours, Dora's, and Nicholas DeMonchaux's on Wednesday, I think leave me incredibly optimistic about our generation and what we're going to keep doing. So I'm really happy to have gotten a part in it, and I look forward to continuing that part. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Andrew, for being here.